Fresh Arts International presents Fresh Talk, conversations about creativity in the 21st century. This episode of Fresh Talk features participants in the most recent International Artists in Residence program at Artpace San Antonio. I'll be speaking with Leslie Hewitt, Jacco, Olivier, and Mike Osborne, artists selected by curator Sarah Lewis. The projects they created while in residence are now on view at Artpace in the New Works 12.2 exhibition. An artist based in New York and Houston, Leslie Hewitt worked with photography and sculpture. Leslie's exhibition, Where Paths Meet, Turn Away, Then Align Again, investigates the conceptual space of history and memory through minimalist sculpture. I'm here at Artpace today with Leslie Hewitt. She's one of the 3 participants in the International Artists in Residence program at Artpace in San Antonio. And she lives part-time in Houston, part-time in New York.
Yes.
And I am here in the space where she created the work and is showing the work, which I think is a really interesting paradigm to have the studio become the gallery. How did you and Sarah Lewis meet?
Oftentimes the relationship between curators and artists is something that evolves, which I think is an amazing aspect of being an artist and being a part of an artist community. And I think because there are many people that are responsible for the art world, right? So you have curators, you have independent curators, you have institutions, you have residencies, you have artists. So all of these things support our experience of art. I wanted to use that as a preface to speaking about Sarah, because I think we met in an incidental way. There was a Harvard art history conference, I believe it was called Bridging the Gap, that Henry Louis Gates organized, and we met at the conference and took the train together on the way back. So it was very incidental that we happened to be the same place, and because of the power of this particular conference and the artists that presented, you wanted to continue to talk about it after you left. And so we were on the train together, and it generated a lot of really positive interest. And you have no idea at that point how things will progress. The curatorial relationships that I value are ones that grow, right? So you meet at one point and you continue to connect, you continue to check in with each other, perhaps even the curator's interests evolve and change, and it may not align with what you're doing right now, but if you stay connected because there's a similar interest, interesting things can happen. In the best case scenario, it is this growth, right? Because the artist is doing one thing and the curator has this perspective. And when it's done really well, when a curator really understands an artist, then really something amazing can happen in that process, so, yeah.
Here at Artpace, what did you bring? What did you plan to do with your time here?
I am research driven, so I was introduced to a particular archive 2 years ago, and really my relationship with this particular archive and looking at the images and thinking about the history that was represented in this particular archive, and it's the Adelaide de Menil and Edmund Carpenter photography collection, specifically focusing on the civil rights era. Through that process, questions arise. For me, that process ends up being generative for a work of art, and sometimes it's directly related and sometimes it's not. So it's not this like kind of very linear process, but it is a process nonetheless. So I knew that I wanted to do something with this, with what I have been working with research-wise, and I knew that I wanted to do a sculpture. And why did I know that? I was very confident, even though it could have changed easily. But I think my understanding of Artpace was really the support, to really focus on a project that really is ambitious. And not to say that film is, anything can be extremely ambitious, but I knew the scale of the sculpture, at least for me personally, would have been a first. And so I really thought this would be the ideal scenario to kind of focus on one project, to have the support, and to make it.
They're all white, powder coated, and they're all the same size, right?
Yes.
What is the scale?
It's 48 inches by 96.
And they have this reference almost of paper.
Yes.
Which is so wonderful because they're heavy.
It's sheet metal.
Sheet metal.
Yes.
And so it has this, as I think you described, it has a solidity to it, but it also has a fragility. What was the meaning of the folds and the angles that you created with these flat planes? Each one of them is different, but they have a relationship with a fold, an angle.
Yes. So, ultimately where 2 points meet, right? There's a shift in a direction. And that was something that was also really, I think, quite elegant when you work with metal, that you can make this transformation happen in a very simple gesture, almost like a drawing, like a line, right? That's all of a sudden completely shifting directions, shifting in terms of your perception of proportion. There's all these things that really can happen in 3 dimensions. Like when you make a simple gesture in 3 dimensions, it kind of has, another resonance. One of the things that also is really intriguing to me with my work in terms of looking at the past is how that past, it's always shifting. We want it to be fixed, right? Because it's a historical moment, but our perception of that moment also shifts over time, right? So it's a fixed point, but it's always slightly shifting. And so for me, these small gestures, even though they almost become monumental because there's one in certain objects or certain sculptures. In certain sculptures, it's 2 gestures, 2 shifts, but your perception of the object is radically shifted just by a simple turn, a simple gesture.
Tell me about what difference it made to be making this work at Artpace in San Antonio rather than anywhere else you could have made the work.
You're always going to respond to the location that you're in. I think I came with a loose idea of what I wanted to do. It came into a clearer formation when I was physically here, who I was here with. There are all of these things, like the 2 artists that were here when I was here, the fact that we're here during the summer versus the kind of winter months, the fact that I was able to gain access to actually go to Houston. So there were a lot of things that I didn't know for sure were going to work out, but they did. If it was made somewhere else, I'm sure it would have been different. But I can't quantify in a way.
I think what you're speaking to is the resources and the support for the artists in the space is so significant that it had to have an impact on the outcome of the residency.
Yes, and I will add to that, it didn't interfere with the process of creating, right, or developing as an artist. And I think sometimes when it's so rigid in the sense that you have to produce exactly what you said or what you proposed, in a way that's, at least for me, not the same as the natural progression, right, that happens when you develop something. You don't know exactly how it's going to turn out. You could, but that would be the same as, I don't know, like a machine doing it, or, right. Just in terms of just putting data into a computer and having, just the output and never thinking again about it and having different decisions. So I think the beautiful thing about making a work here at Artpace is you never felt that, they were very respectful and acknowledged that every artist is different, and really the kind of support that they provided was also trusting that would produce something, kind of fresh and authentic to the particular artist.
Amsterdam-based artist Jacco Olivier decided to push his animated paintings from narrative to abstraction while he was at Artpace. Exploring San Antonio and studying the paintings of American artist Helen Frankenthaler, Jacco intensified the texture and palette of his work in the Texas-sized painting he named Cycle. How did you meet Sarah Lewis, the curator?
Sarah Lewis, she was doing the Site Santa Fe Biennale in 2010, and that was about video art. And so I didn't directly meet her, but she asked me to participate. And so she knows my work from there. And that was a nice, successful show. Later she asked me to do a project in Madison Square Park in New York. So I had this commission to make works in Madison Square Park last winter, and I worked with her as well. And then she asked me to do a residency. That's how we know each other.
So you do have some history.
I do have some history, yeah, two things, yeah.
What I see here is we're looking at a painting that is animated, or layers of paintings that are animated that create a landscape themselves that's flowing around 3 panels and taking up how many feet this takes?
It is 14 meters, I know, because I'm metric.
Good. Tell me how this installation and the work itself has been influenced by being in San Antonio.
Well, I came here without any idea of what I wanted to do. I thought I'm gonna go with the flow and see what happens. So for the first few weeks I was just looking around, and they had a bike here, so I was discovering biking the city a lot. And I was amazed by being from Amsterdam. All the colors and the buildings were very exotic to me. So I was really psyched about the way they use color here on the buildings and the hand-painted signs. And I took a lot of photographs and just took in the atmosphere. Then I went painting for about 3-4 weeks, and I just moved around color on panels a lot. And I took photographs of what I painted, and with the photographs I started to build an animation. I wanted to do a landscape thing with a river in it, and I just started building, and this is what it became in the end.
So why river?
I noticed this San Antonio is quite obsessed with the river. They have a river walk. It's always on every website. It's the river, the river. And it's also, you have a nice biking path along the river, and I needed some kind of just a little thing to pin down my animation. And I liked to have some movement, like watery movement in there. So that's where I started, and it broke gradually from there into this landscape you see now. The total length of the film is 14 minutes. In art school, I really wanted to be a painter, and I still consider myself a painter. And in art school, we wanted to be like the American painters, wanted to make big paintings. And but it always took a long time for me to do that. Sometimes it was more than a half year, or sometimes a year working on one painting, layer over layer. And I couldn't quite make up my mind about it, and I wanted to know why certain pieces of paint did work and other pieces didn't. So I started making photographs of tiny cutouts of my paintings and watched them as slides in my studio. And I noticed that looking at the slides of the pieces of paint, they kind of much more, they did it much more for me than the painting itself. And when I was asked for my first international exhibition in the Secession in Vienna, I was really insecure about my paintings, and I thought, no, I'm gonna show my slides. So I showed a sequence of 7 slides, very closely to the wall, so you can see it in daylight, very small. And that was in 1998, so we all had this personal computer at home by then. And instead of doing the slides one by one, I was able to fade one into another. And if you put a sequence of slides and you fade one into another, suddenly you already have an animation in a way. And then I was asked to do an exhibition at Victoria Miro in London, which is a big gallery in Europe. And I thought, well, I have nothing to lose, so I'm just going to show those animations. And they kind of, they were picked up, and I think the animations were also much closer to my skin than the paintings, because during office hours I was still making those big paintings, and at night I was just playing around with the animations like you were playing with Lego or Playmobil. I think that was the trick, to go for the thing which was really close to your skin, because I was a little bit afraid it was too playful or something. But yeah, I just showed it, and then it opened something up for me, because suddenly I could make up my own rules, and I didn't have a whole history of painting on my shoulders, and I could make my own little animations, and they turned out to be really painterly, and I wanted to move away from the narrative part. Like, I didn't want to be in the realm of animation as in animation festivals. I really wanted to have them perceived as being moving paintings, and that's how I became.
Is this scale larger than you've ever done before? The 3 projectors?
It is very large. I did one other big animation from a moving whale, which I did on about 20 meters, because that's like a size a whale can be. And but normally most of my animations were like really small, only almost letter size against the wall, so you can see them in daylight. If you didn't like it, you just step to the next one. I really want to perceive them as, like I said, as painting, and not that you had to sit down and as a cinema thing. Sometimes it's just nice to make something in a larger scale, because I like that kind of accidents that happens in my paint, drips of paint and the texture of the paint. If you blow that up to this scale, then it becomes something very materialized, very different than it is.
It's almost sculptural.
It's almost sculptural in a way. You can even see you can see the light, you can see the grain of the wood, you can see the shadows of how I took the photograph, and although it's flat and it's of course a projection, you very much see the painterly gesture in there.
How has this experience of creating this work in San Antonio influenced what you will do next?
I noticed that a lot of my work, they kind of, one work after another, it always kind of changes gradually. Before this, I had done once a galaxy piece, and I thought, well, that's, you take a lot for granted. If you have a galaxy, you can get away with a lot. So I wanted to do something more earthy, and this was a good opportunity to try that. I think it's a more difficult approach to make it feel like we are standing on the floor and you're looking at the moving landscape. And the few things I really did change is that I became very interested in the American abstractionists, like Helen Frankenthaler, like I told you, because I don't know, she was not on my radar. I know she's very famous and I've probably seen her before, but I never had this click or so, and it definitely changed my palette, because I have a certain kind of colors I always come back to, I think almost unconsciously, but here people use yellow, purple, green, just put it all together, and that kind of struck me as being quite beautiful. In this particular piece, I started with the abstract part, but it still has a lot of reference, and even in the beginning I did a whole of like buildings and this whole cityscape, so it is still very figurative, and here it ends on a rainbow, which is still, it's just all this kind of narrative or figurative feeling in there. But I think I'm ready to move on to I feel more confident now to go to the total abstraction kind of thing, because for example, I really like.
His Artpace residency was an opportunity for Austin-based artist Mike Osborne to develop a book and an installation. Using photographs he took in the desert landscape of Wendover, Utah, Mike plays with the boundaries of narrative, truth, and artifice to create his floating island project. I'm talking to Mike Osborne, the Texan that was selected to be in the International Artists in Residence program at Artpace. You were selected by Sarah Lewis, and I'm wondering, how did you get in a position to be noticed by Sarah?
Well, the way that the Artpace selection process works is that a curator is selected, and then that curator is given the responsibility for selecting the 3 artists who will participate in residency. One of the artists is an international artist, and in this case it's Jacco Olivier. One of the artists is a nationally known artist, and in this case is Leslie Hewitt. And then the 3rd artist comes from Texas, and the way that that Texas artist is selected is that there's an application process. People submit applications, and then those applications are turned over to the curators to review. They can see work in the form of digital slides, and then based on their assessment of those digital slides, they come to Texas, make a series of studio visits, and then based on those studio visits, make a selection. So I'd actually had studio visits like that once or twice before, based on applications, and then met with Sarah Lewis last summer for a studio visit, and after she returned to New York, received word that I'd been selected for the residency.
What did you work on while you were here?
So while I was here, I worked on several things simultaneously. During the year of 2011 and 12, I'd been a resident artist at the Center for Land Use Interpretation's Wendover Residence Program, which is something that Matt Coolidge and the Center for Land Use Interpretation established in Wendover, Utah, back in the mid-90s, I believe, late 90s. And it's hosted a series of artists every year since then. So a large number of artists have gone to Wendover to make work usually related to the landscape in some way. And this was a very good fit for me because I'm deeply interested in the problems of representing place, and Wendover is a particularly complicated place with a very interesting history that involves military history, but also its kind of contemporary casino culture, in addition to being a phenomenally interesting place in terms of its geology and its natural landscape.
Also, you mentioned earlier about it being a stand-in in movies, which
Sure.
I think is a fascinating element of its identity.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, the Center for Land Use Interpretation, in addition to hosting this residency or kind of creating the context for other artists to produce their work, which is a phenomenally generous thing that they do, they also basically created a living situation there in Wendover, which contains sort of supplemental materials, kind of a library. It's not instructive in any way, but they simply make materials available to the visiting artists that would be of interest or kind of stimulating in some way. And one of the pieces that they've created that's there is a work. It's in a way it's related to like Christian Marclay's The Clock. It's just a series of little snippets that they've taken from primarily Hollywood films that happen to take place in that landscape. And you know, of course I knew of that sort of relation of that landscape to advertising, but I wasn't quite as aware of its role in cinema. And so there's a whole range of roles that this landscape has played, ranging from the apocalyptic, as in a movie like Independence Day, to a kind of serene sort of afterlife heaven type of location in Terrence Malick's Tree of Life, to roles in a movie like Pirates of the Caribbean, which I have not actually seen, but which has scenes that take place out in the salt flats, and a whole range of other movies. There's also a history of photographers having worked there, which was of interest to me and may not necessarily be immediately evident to viewers, but Richard Misrak made a series of photographs dealing specifically with Wendover's military history back in the 1980s, early 1980s, I believe. And before him, Robert Frank actually made a film in Wendover relating to a scientist named Robert Golka who was attempting to find new ways of transmitting electricity in the very hangar where the Enola Gay, the atomic bomb plane, had been stored. So there's this kind of sort of phenomenal layering of sort of actual historical events with artistic and cinematic representations of the place.
So how did you come to photography as your medium? It seems important to talk about that.
Sure, yeah. As an undergrad, I studied literature primarily and photography as a kind of side engagement, something that I just enjoyed doing. But the further I get away from that, the more I realize that my photographic impulse is in a way deeply related to the literary studies that I was engaged in at the time. So I think that's most evident actually in this recent body of work shot in Wendover, where the book that I've produced for this Artpace exhibition is actually the primary form of the work. I think of it as being more substantial in a way than the photographic prints on the wall, or more significant in terms of the way that it's advancing my practice. So, and in terms of how that connects to this literary background, the book has 96 pictures, so it's a much more sort of extended meditation than what is possible on the walls. And it contains 13 chapters, which are sort of kind of quasi-literary in form. Maybe they could be thought of as little short stories or little vignettes.
But it's totally photographic, there's no text.
It's completely photographic. The only text that appears is in the breaks. Between each chapter, there's a 2-page break that states the chapter title before proceeding into the next set of photographs.
So the narrative we're talking about is a visual narrative that is where you're led through an idea or a place.
Exactly,
with the photographs.
And the breaks between the chapters are sort of deliberately disjunctive. So rather than, say, having all of the kind of military photographs together, or all of the casino photographs together, or all of the more sort of atmospheric landscapes together, I've deliberately interspersed them so that there's a feeling of sort of moving in and out of different worlds, even though all the photographs are made within, or most of the photographs are made within, 10 or 15 miles of one another.
And is that where you got the title for this exhibition, The Floating Island?
Yeah, the title Floating Island comes from the name of a small mountain that's at the end of the Bonneville Salt Flats, several miles outside of Wendover. And the reason that became the title and is such a sort of central aspect of the project is that this small mountain appears to sort of hover above the horizon. It undergoes what's called an inferior mirage, so it sort of perpetually appears to be hovering above the horizon line. And this sort of idea of a real illusion, an illusion that's always there and that is an actual sort of phenomenon as opposed to a kind of intervention. Something that was really interesting to me in relation to the ideas of sort of fictionalizing and the ideas of narrative construction that are running, and artifice and so forth, that are running through the rest of the project.
Tell me how you tied what you're doing to being in San Antonio. What difference did it make to be making this work here?
Sure, yeah. Well, I had grown up in San Antonio, so I had a long history with the place, even though I hadn't lived here full-time for over 10 years. One of the things that you're encouraged to do as a resident here is to think of how you can do something pivotal for your practice. And I thought a lot about that word pivotal, and in my own work there's sort of two kind of primary things that I do. There's the work that I do out in the world, and then there's the work that I do at a desk in my studio or at home or wherever, where I'm working to kind of impose an order on the kind of material that I've collected out in the world. And so for me, Artpace was an opportunity to take this massive material that was first and foremost in my mind over the course of the last year, and to kind of hammer it out quite quickly actually into a form where I could have it produced as a book in time for the exhibitions. I've shot an enormous amount of new work here at Artpace.
What was transformative about the experience to your practice?
I don't know that I would say that any of it was transformative, but I'm enormously grateful for the opportunity to simply be engaged full-time on my work with an extraordinarily skilled support staff that is able to open doors and to facilitate things that as an individual practitioner would be extremely difficult to do. So for example,
been listening to Fresh Talk with artists in residence at Artpace San Antonio. Read more about Artpace and the artists and hear other podcasts in this series on freshartinternational.com.